トビデオ
The light novel might just be one of the big game-changing inventions for the anime industry. Popular literature in Japan has a very long-standing history, so of course, like with every other literary culture, alongside the highbrow pure literature works of the Murakamis and the Mishimas lies the low art. Literature for the masses. That's what the light novel encompasses. The light novels are meant to be serialized works that primarily cater to young adults and are marketed with enticing illustrations done in the popular art style you would normally find in manga. They are also mass-produced, written very quickly, sell for peanuts, and result in a very high author turnover rate that causes publishing companies to always be on the lookout for emerging talents. For this reason, the emergence of the light novel industrial complex has been a boon for anime producers. With increased demand for anime that came at the turn of the 21st century, production companies are always willing to take the safest bet by adapting any popular light novel. The more light novels there are out in the wild, the more light novel adaptations there will be to meet the anime-consuming public demands. Some anime fans have clearly taken umbrage with this new industry development that has persisted since the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya took off. That it has flooded the market with shows that are just as disposable as their source material and are drowning out actually original works. Maybe you could say that the anime industry would be better off if the light novel never existed in the first place. Sure, we would lose out on some truly excellent shows in the process, but it would be worth it in the end if the crap was filtered out more efficiently, right? 1, there's always going to be crap anime, and B, the light novel format has existed in ways that actually predates anime through one of the oldest forms of low art ever devised, the pulp magazine. For as long as there have been inexpensive paper and wild imaginations, the pulp magazine has been the most efficient way to deliver genre fiction to the masses. The Japanese light novel format as we know it began through serialized pulp magazines after all. And just like the light novel, there were honest-to-god anime adaptations of the stories that were being told in these anthology magazines, the most famous of which being Record of Lodos War and Dirty Pair. Adaptations of stories from pulp magazines are relatively fewer than its vast progeny, but those lucky few that do exist, like today's subject, are kind of hidden gems regardless of actual quality. What I'm getting at here is that, in the realm of pulp fiction, here, there be monsters.
I can't use your real name, so we need to think of a code name.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, as they're using Dracula, I shall be known as Bat.
A group of armed terrorists attack a United States military base. While they are ultimately repelled, they not only were able to storm their way in pretty deep, but were also shown to exhibit some highly unusual features. It could be none other than vampires. Across the Atlantic in the red light district of Paris, a local mercenary arrives too late to save a sex worker friend of his from being butchered by a random psycho. Yeah, this anime is starting things off real classy-like. Though he dispatches the psycho, the mercenary, named Kozuburo Kuki, still ends up getting framed for her murder. With the cops closing in on all sides, Kozuburo is forced to make a deal with the shady international agency Wing and its French representative Georges Lassar. Find out the mystery behind the recent vampire terrorist attack, and his name will be cleared.
You want to hear something strange? The code name for this project is D, which I happen to know stands for Dracula in this instance.
Very intriguing.
Who exactly are this group of vampires? What is their involvement with the American CIA? And does Wing really have Kozuburo's best interest at heart?
So you're going to do it then?
Well, that all depends on what it is. Then I'll decide whether I want to do it or not.
As you can probably tell from the clips I've shown so far, 1991's Vampire Wars is one of those anime. The OVA era's brackish backwash that infected the first half of the 90s like an irritating rash.
Apart from the bit about the pimp, it's all bullshit.
However, there is something about Vampire Wars that makes me unable to completely dismiss it. It has a certain quality to it that separates it from its more unsalvageable contemporaries. Partially, I ascribe this to some of the staff behind this anime, where we will soon see a lot of surprising names pop out. But even if it might be more watchable than your standard manga entertainment stopgaps, it's still just as dumb, to the point that its dumbness both hinders it and also kinda helps it. I know this might be a little out of season to cover a vampire anime, but there's so many of them out there, I might not get through them all if I kept them constrained to October. And frankly, I can't wait until autumn to show the world something this hilariously asinine. Not to Sovereign of the Damned levels, of course, but it gets close.
You have been revived solely for the purpose of destroying your own father!
File down your fangs, you creatures of the night. We're gonna see why Vampire Wars, in spite of its best efforts, might not be a vampire bore. So if you remember my introductory spiel at the top, here's the point where I get to fully connected to the main topic at hand. Vampire Wars began as an 11-volume serialized story published in the literary magazine Yasai Jidai from January 1982 to November 1988. All of which was written by author Kiyoshi Kasai, a high school dropout who would eventually go on to Wako University, where he got expelled. Kasai was heavily involved in the Marxist student organizations that were a part of Japan's New Left movement of the 60s. However, like many of his generation, he soon became disillusioned with the movement, thanks to a combination of factionalism within the overall movement and the Asamo Sanso incident, where members of the United Red Army took an innkeeper's wife hostage after killing 14 of their own members along with an innocent bystander in a violent purge. In 1974, feeling politically adrift and wanting to search for, in his own words, left-wing thought that does not depend on Marx, Kasai moved to Paris, France. It was here he discovered that what he ultimately wanted to do was become a writer. In 1979, he published his first novel, a detective story called Bye Bye Angel. It introduced readers to Kasai's unique approach to writing his mysteries, where the detective and the culprit are portrayed more as dueling philosophers debating each other in their cat and mouse game. Of course, his breakout hit was Vampire Wars. While it being a far cry from Kasai's usual detective story that he prefers writing, it still had that philosophical mystery bent to it. Centered around former mercenary turned university professor Kozuburo Kuki being forced to return to the life he left behind in order to solve a supernatural mystery with shady government agencies intertwined around it, allowing him to present themes that were both spiritual and political in nature. At the time of this video, Kasai is currently enjoying a pretty secure legacy in the Japanese literature community. He has numerous detective novels under his belt, and has mentored younger light novelists who specialize in mysteries, most notably Kazuki Sakuraba of Gothic fame. And from what I've also gleaned, Kasai also has a bit of a reputation as a Japanese literary gadfly, if one could charitably call him that. He is publicly feuded with novelist Yoriko Shono and postmodernist Shigehiko Hasumi, and has advocated for the end of pure literature in favor of the pulp fiction he and his students specialize in. His politics also took a sharp turn rightward into assholeville in the 90s, with him arguing that the state should be dismantled in favor of mass privatization of all parts of society, in essence becoming an anarcho-capitalist. That's a real shame. But back to Vampire Wars. The series' popularity had reached new heights when Kadokawa Shoten started publishing the series in novella form, with illustrations by famed Sunrise legend Hiroyuki Kitazume. And with this popularity falling in line with the height of the OVA era, the story of course was going to be licensed out to a company. But with how this anime looks, you would expect that the studio that licensed it for adaptation would be a studio like Magic Bus, or it being one of AIC's lower priority titles. But that's where you're wrong, my friends. The studio that licensed Vampire Wars was... That is correct! Toei Animation and all its Dragon Ballin', One Piecein', Captain Harlockin', Mapletown, and Puss in Boots and Glory were the ones responsible for the Vampire Wars anime. At this time, Toei had been in the OVA game since 1985 and had produced some well-regarded titles like Crying Freeman and previous episode subject Sugeban Deka. Unfortunately, they were also responsible for a lot of crap of this time period, being co-producers for the blemish on Osamu Tezuka's resume Sword for Truth, and producing an adaptation of another Kasai work known as Psychic Wars that same year, to less than satisfactory results. But it seems that Toei really did want to put their best foot forward with Vampire Wars, at least initially when they assembled the staff. For director, they had Kazuhisa Takanouchi. He was already a well-established storyboarder for Toei and had already made his film debut proper with the third Dragon Ball movie, Mystical Adventure. He would later go on to do Interstellar 5555, one of my favorite anime movies of all time. He would also do the 5th One Piece movie, Curse of the Sacred Sword, which is a movie that the One Piece fandom, myself included, don't really like. So, quite a mixed bag there. But what really signaled Toei trying to make this Vampire Wars anime work was assigning screenwriting duties to Hiroyuki Hoshiyama. If you don't know who he is, he's one of the many writers who helped Yoshiyuki Tomino in assembling the first Mobile Suit Gundam anime, on top of writing some of the series' most standout episodes. These not only include the first and last episodes of Gundam, but also the episode where Bright successfully snaps Amuro out of his depressive funk, and the episode where Amuro and fan favorite Rambo Raw meet face to face and duke it out in the desert. He also wrote the script for Dirty Pair Project Eden, but let's not hold that against him. With people they obviously trusted behind the wheel, it seemed like Toei really did want this to be one of the better OVA productions they had to offer. Did it succeed? Well, the product certainly speaks for itself, don't it?
I'm having trouble buying this. You're saying she's some kind of space monster?
Okay, in all seriousness, I'm actually not that down on the animation as much as my words and the overall look of this anime say otherwise. Toei actually did assign some of their A-list animators to Vampire Wars, and you can actually see them in action. The animation director for this anime is the talented Hideki Hamasu, not slouching in any conceivable way. And you have talented key animators like Junichi Hayama on the scene as well. Hayama especially, since he is the reason why a lot of the fight scenes in Vampire Wars have this great choreography to them. Takanuchi is also helping elevate this anime through some pretty creative storyboarding. It not only keeps the visuals on screen stimulating, but also results in some pretty gnarly on-screen deaths. You don't always get to see someone's chest get caved in with a chair animated, but Vampire Wars changes all that.
Sir, please help! You gotta shoot her! She's crushing the life out of me!
But don't think I'm gonna be letting the cheap look of this anime off the hook. Whenever the animation is good in Vampire Wars, it feels like it is straining under its confines of budget. Whatever artistic merits the animation has, it's all under the auspice of creators trying the best with the tools they were given. Which, considering that Toei were the only ones funding this little project, that probably wasn't much. By the way, if you do plan on watching this, I can only recommend that you watch this dub. It's a manga entertainment joint from the 90s, so of course it's going to be hilarious, stilted, and unreasonably crass.
Ha! I bet you fist fuck your wife because you don't know what to do with your cock! Pah!
I don't know where to start with this dub's highlights. Maybe it's Kozuburo's voice actor doing his best Shatner and giving a performance that's simultaneously stiff and wooden, but also incredibly overdramatic.
Here, drink this now. It'll help you relax yourself. And don't worry, all I did was carry you here. I haven't interfered with you or molested you or anything.
Or how the way everybody pronounces his name, it sounds like they are calling him Mr. Cookie.
Please sit down and listen, Mr. Cookie.
Or how one of Lazar's gigantic henchmen is given a voice that sounds exactly like Dr. Claw and Inspector Gadget.
Get this two-time slut out of here.
Or how, because this takes place in France, you get to hear a ton of Brits do their best bad French accents 80% of the time. I'm surprised we don't get a ho in here.
Oh, you bet. I know everything about her. But you know, she suddenly stopped making movies 6 months ago, and I have no idea why.
However, the gold in Vampire Wars' overall inanity lies within its story. Like with the animators, you get the feeling that Hoshiyama was trying to do his best with the materials he was given. And it's not that the source material is bad. I think I just read the plot synopsises, but I do think he was told to dumb down the material for mass appeal. Kozuburo is no longer a professor and is still working as a freelance mercenary in the story, and there's very little philosophical or even political themes aside from CIA bad.
Where's Lamia?
She's here enjoying the CIA's legendary hospitality.
Which I do agree, but it does strike me odd that reading material that you could normally buy at a 7-Eleven would even need to be dumbed down for the masses, but hey, I guess that's why I'm not a producer. But even if this is the dumb as rocks approach to adaptation, Vampire Wars' story is pretty obtuse. It's natural for these types of cheapo adaptations trying to fit too much story into an hour runtime, but Vampire Wars hits that sweet spot of being too dense with its story while also clearly trying to stretch it for time purposes. Kozuburo's first interaction with Lasar involves him getting kidnapped and tied to an electric torture chair to convince him to take the job. This ends with him performing a great escape and resting in a safe house owned by his close confidant and former left-wing terrorist, Meraki.
Meraki and I went back a long way. We'd hatched a plot to blow up Tokyo's financial district by dropping a remote-controlled airliner packed with high explosives into it. It flattened it like a dog turd under a steamroller.
But then Kozuburo goes back to Lazar, holds him at gunpoint, and takes the deal anyway, just on his terms now. There's no reason he couldn't have done this the first time he was there and got free of his clutches. Just take one of his guys' guns and make a deal. It's not that hard. The only good explanation is that this sets up Kozuburo's relationship with Meraki, but aside from providing arms support later in the story, he's barely a factor in the plot at large. It's also a little hard to tell what kind of story Vampire Wars is trying to be. The original appears to be a supernatural thriller mystery with elements of romance sprinkled throughout, with Kozuburo's relationship with actress/model/heterosexual love interest Lamia. But it's not much of a mystery since Kozuburo does very little detective work, and the answers are usually just told to him rather than having us figure it out for ourselves.
So he contacted a colleague, a Japanese doctor. It was Junji Shimamura.
Yeah, I've heard of him. He's one of the world's leading authorities on molecular biology. He won a Nobel Prize recently.
And the romance? Well, maybe it's just me, but it had all the passion and chemistry of a teenaged girl trying to hug and kiss a piece of lumber.
Enough now.
I'm afraid.
But like with the animation, I don't want to come off as completely down on the story. There's actually some pretty inventive plot twists. The big one being that Kozuburo discovering that Lamia is not a vampire, but a weird being from outer space. This ends up getting traced back to the blonde vampire that attacked her, Gilbert Barthol, and we soon find out that the vampires we think are vampires are actually aliens. And the whole explanation plays out like Dracula's Scientology audits.
While the Larusians learned to hold Zaruka, the universal life force in their veins. Thus, in different ways, both were able to cheat death. Their civilizations were able to spread through the galaxies.
But the best part is that Kozuburo totally trusts these guys and realizes that the real enemy is his handlers and the CIA. And he's totally right once they kidnap Lamia. This is totally crazy, and it signals that somewhere in this mess, there's a good story to be told. But unfortunately, for Vampire Wars' case, that story is very poorly told. And I mean it.
Now it's up to you, Kuki.
Show, don't tell is not a hard and fast rule, but it is encouraged for a reason. Every plot point in this anime is just breathlessly explained to Kozuburo, or is the result of Kozuburo getting the answer off screen and explaining it to someone else.
What is alpha chloride E2?
It's the name given to a special protein which was extracted from Lamia's blood crystals.
His name is Jean-Louis Brun, an authority on blood disorders, and he's head of the National Blood Research Laboratory.
No one could find the reason behind it or any treatment for it. Eventually, my doctor decided it was best to refer me to Dr. Brand.
He said the CIA are convinced that the terrorists who attacked the NASA base were actually vampires.
So that's why they call him Vamp. No, Vamp isn't for vampire, it's because he's bisexual.
Even if it's just a minor detail which results in some unintentional hilarity.
Do you remember the prostitute whose face you smashed up? She found that she wasn't able to earn a living anymore, so she committed suicide.
But you can see why this is a bad way to tell your story, right? Characters explaining details of the plot to you breathlessly in an attempt to hastily tie story beats to each other does not make for a riveting narrative in a visual media. Even when the story ends, characters are still vomiting out exposition, just in case we missed anything.
That isn't the only thing I found I could do. There are 2 pilots flying this plane. When I went into the cockpit, they tried to attack me, but when I looked into their eyes, they were unable to move.
Alright, I get it!
This is what I mean by Hoshiyama not being given the best material to work with. It sounds like they only had so much story to work on and had to cut and paste the narrative together so it could make a lick of sense. And while I'm at it, let me make the trite observation that the war in Vampire Wars wasn't so much of a war. It was much more of a clash, or a dispute, or maybe even an engagement at most, but not a war. I only bring that up because what else is there to say about this anime? Vampire Wars is a silly and half-baked attempt to adapt one of the more popular pulp fictions of the day, turning what is low art into something even lower. But at the end of the day, it's still watchable anime trash, which as we know, is the best kind of anime trash. Thanks to some talented animators and a comical retro dub, it's a solid B-movie OVA. Hey, with how Vampire Wars looks and how it tells its story, you could do a lot worse with an anime about space vampire terrorists.
I hear it's to do with an unusual nucleic acid in her DNA. Oh, shit!